Hi, I'm Candida Moss, and I'm the Cadbury Professor of Theology here at the University of Birmingham. And I'm here today to talk to you about some myths about Christmas. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, with everything that happened in 2020, surely she doesn't have to burst our bubble about Christmas too. So I'm going to do my best to keep it light. But there are a lot of things that we think about Christmas that we learned when we took part in nativity plays that actually aren't quite right. The first is just the date. We celebrate the birth of Jesus of Nazareth on December 25th, as we all know. But when you read the Gospel of Luke, we're told that the reason why shepherds attended the birth of Jesus was because they were watching their flocks by night. Why were they out on the hillside watching their flocks? Because it was the lambing season and they were there to help with the birth of the new lambs. They could only have been there, though, if it was springtime. So it's much more likely that Jesus was born in the spring than in Christmas time as we celebrate it. In fact, early Christians didn't seem to be that interested in Christmas or the birth of Jesus. The first reference to his birth is found in the writings of the 3rd century Egyptian writer Clement of Alexandria, but he doesn't mention December 25th. It's only in the 4th century that we even get a reference to a celebration. And it's then in the 4th century that the Pope decides that we should actually celebrate as a religious group. It's in the 7th century that the date gets formalized, and it's from that point onwards that we start to think about the birth of Jesus as taking place in December. It's not just the date that is a little off. When we put on nativity plays, we often portray Jesus as being born in a stable. The reason for that is that there was no room for Jesus at the inn. But the word for inn in Greek is Cataluma, and it actually doesn't mean anything like a hostel or hotel. It means something like guest quarters. Houses in ancient Bethlehem used to have an upper room that was split into 2 parts. One was for the main family, and the other part was really small quarters known as a Cataluma that was sort of your guest suite or your guest bedroom. But they were small, people didn't have a lot of space, and there certainly wasn't enough space for a woman to give birth to a baby. So instead, she gave birth downstairs in the main room of the house. Now, people didn't just sort of socialize downstairs. They also kept their animals there to protect them from predators and from the cold. And so when we think about the baby Jesus being born in a stable, what we mean is that he was being born in the downstairs room of a house that often would have animals in it. One of the other things related to this kind of mythology of Jesus being born in a stable is the manger. In fact, a lot of people think that manger is just sort of another word for a stable, but it actually means a trough from which animals would eat. And people would use these troughs to kind of divide up the space in their house so that they could have humans doing stuff on one side of the room and animals on the other. So manger just means in French manger, and it just refers to sort of the trough from which animals would eat. But it still doesn't mean that Jesus was born in a stable. While we're talking about mangers, you may have heard the very popular Christmas carol, Away in a Manger. It might even be your favorite. And you might have heard that this Christmas carol was written by Martin Luther, who was the founder of Protestantism and the person who really kicked off the Reformation some 500 years ago. But actually, Martin Luther has nothing to do with this Christmas carol. The reason that we think that he does is because in 1883, a Boston magazine published the lyrics of Away in a Manger with the title Luther's Cradle Song. This gave rise to the sort of misimpression that Luther was somehow involved in the composition of this song. But it wasn't even until 1934 that Away in a Manger was even translated into German. We don't actually know who it was written by, but it seems to come from America, and the earliest adaptation of it comes from a late 19th century children's book. Finally, there's the question of the 3 wise men. Now, you've probably all heard the other Christmas carol, We Three Kings, and you probably also knew that they're not actually kings, that the Greek word magoi means magus, or sort of a wise man or even magician. Now, the interesting thing about the story is that the Gospel of Matthew, who tells us about the wise men who came to visit Jesus, doesn't tell us how many wise men there were. So they could have been 8, there could have been 2. The reason we think that there are 3 is because they bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and we're assuming that just like with sort of a modern birthday party, each wise man only brought 1 gift. But we don't know that, we're just assuming it. While we're still talking about it, we should probably talk about how old Jesus was when this kind of birthday party with the Magi took place. And the answer is he probably wasn't even an infant. When the wise men come to Herod and ask where they can find the baby Jesus, or as they put it, he who was born the King of the Jews, Herod then decides to have all of the children under the age of 2 killed. The reason for that was it took the wise men a really long time to get to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, up to 2 years, in fact. And Herod wasn't going to take any chances. All of which means that the child that the 3 wise men came to visit might have actually been a toddler and not a baby. Perhaps the most surprising thing of all about Christmas is that if you go and read the New Testament, you'll find that there's no place that tells our modern nativity story from start to finish. There's no sort of chapter of a gospel that has shepherds and kings in the same scene. The reason for that is that our modern nativity stories are a combination of the versions found in the Gospel of Luke, who has shepherds and angels and emphasizes Mary, and the Gospel of Matthew, who has wise men and gifts and emphasizes the kingship of Jesus. I hope that you've enjoyed learning more about the actual Christmas legend and where our traditions come from. And I hope that if you celebrate, you have a very Merry Christmas.